just as people get stuck on whatever they know, whatever they invest in, whatever their status is built on, whatever their frame is that they understand the world by, and helps them navigate the world. People tend to think about predicting the future as picking the most likely thing to happen. And that's exactly how to fail. What you do instead, and this is something Napoleon is probably the biggest secret to Napoleon, is that you saturate yourself in an information stream, or as many of them as you can, especially if they're not constructed information streams. In other words, they're simple records, like Napoleon would do, of things like acquisitions, bills of lading, transactional receipts. And he would have people from all over collect these things and bring them to him. And he's notorious for sitting in his office for hours going through this detailed stuff, because it gave him a mental model of what the world was doing. Not his prediction, not his assumption, not his collected of reported evidence. Remember, demonstrated versus reported, but of demonstrated evidence of what was actually happening. So he would show up on the battlefield as people, how the hell did he know we would be here? So when I look at the world, I start with basic three premises. What you consider the natural law, which I would consider the neural economy of predictable human behavior. I start out with cycle theory, which started out with the libertarians in my standpoint, with the market cycles and then institutional cycles. And then I worked up to Kondratiev and his secular cycles. And then I worked to the great historians and I look at their cycles. And so I interpret all of these as just markets. And so I don't look for what's the most likely outcome. I look for the field of possibilities, and I use the information to update that field, and then I seize the opportunity that arises in that field. It's the same thing. How many people are in the software business here? Engineering? So the trick is that in software engineering, you don't write a plan to produce the software because you think that's actually what's going to happen. You write the plan to ensure you understand the field of errors and mistakes and problems that will likely arise during your attempt to build this. Does that make sense? So when you're I have an incredibly good record through about 2010 of prediction because I paid attention to that constant stream of information. What have I been doing since then? Saying, we got to stop where this is going. So, and secondly, when people are acting and flocking and herding towards things, it's easy to be what's called a contrarian investor. And that's what George Soros does. He looks at what has people's fashionable passions, what do they call it? Animal spirits, and he votes against them. It's similar to what Taleb did, is that he specialized in voting on margins, like in other words, possibilities at the margin that would produce outside returns. So the point I'm trying to get across is that in our conservative, libertarian, and even center-left world, there's a tendency to predict from what we know and understand and to double down on what we know and understand, because the investment in requiring more options of what might happen is too high. And it also makes us feel uncertain and uncomfortable. However, just as when we work in producing our system of measurement that unifies the sciences, all of a sudden you begin to see patterns across sciences. Does that make sense? If you are interested, you might be interested in the stock market, but if you're not also watching technology, geopolitical strategy, demographic distributions, current, current account changes, etc. You might want to reinforce what you think already. You won't see that pattern across those things leading to conclusions. What I'm really saying is prediction is very difficult if you start from the premise that you have an objective. Does that make sense? That you want the future to be a certain way. Because we can't really disentangle the two things. I don't do that. I do what is going to happen, and of these things that could happen, which ones can we influence? We don't get to bring about what we want. We only get to move the rocket ship of history in some direction by a few degrees so that it actually gets closer to our target. The second thing that's a derivation of what I'm explaining is that most of our history is about the masculine means of conflict and warfare, and about how we as men would solve war by masculine means. We've been getting our asses kicked in our own military overseas by fourth generation warfare. We've been getting our asses kicked politically by a form of warfare we've elaborated about today, but we barely understand. And matter of fact, I would argue we're the only ones who understand. We've been getting our civilization's ass kicked across every freaking domain, every institution. Their attempt to march through the institutions of cultural production to bring about the destruction of the masculine, rational, empirical, evolutionarily advantageous, responsible West has succeeded. So what I'm trying to get across to you is an amplification of my warning that there is a tendency of people, especially on the right, but certainly certainly on the libertarian, and certainly in the center and the center left, to think in a frame they understand. But what have we produced? What did we talk about in our first chat today? Has this frame existed before? Reason existed before. Empiricism existed before. Science existed before. But has computation, in the sense we mean it, operational, has it existed before? Because it wasn't possible before. So we understand how to fight male war. Is that really going to help us?
No.
That's the problem. The fragmentation of the right, doubling down on their male understanding of both direction, what they want as a result, whether it would work or not, and the means they think of getting there. It's a problem. Because what the left only has one technique. It's called baiting into hazard. The feminine frame is seduction. But the legal frame is baiting into hazard. So the way they win is by baiting our people into hazard and then hiding behind plausible deniability. The problem is, if you bomb Germany, how long does it take the Germans to rebuild? Like next week? But if you destroy the history, the mythology, the group evolutionary strategy, the institutions, the culture, the assumptions, the traditions, the metaphysics, the values of a people, how can you reconstruct that? You can't. Now the Jews did something interesting, because you got to understand, if you look at the Middle East, especially look at anything Abrahamic, it's just a reaction to Europe. It's a counter-revolution against Europe. For the same reason, they're in a counter-revolution against us today. We're evidence of their failure. The Jews figured something out. They wrote their group strategy as a monopoly combination of religion, economics, and law. So what are we trying to do? We're trying to make it hard to undermine the European group evolutionary strategy by writing it in what we call science and embedding it in law. And we have to thank our forefathers, because truth is, the framers of the Constitution got really freaking close. If anybody's worked with me or read my stuff on the 6, 8, 10, 12 holes in the American Constitution, and then you look at our stuff on natural law, you realize how close they were. They simply hadn't got the systems of measurement that we've been able to produce in this past century. So, capital can be reconstructed. What are you doing there? Children can be born, but destroy the information system, the polity of the East shows, as the Middle East shows. You cannot reconstruct the polity. They're not just trying to get power. They're trying to kill our civilization like the Muslims killed North African, Levantine, Mesopotamian, Anatolian, Persian, Southeast European, old European, and which destroyed the potential of the hybrid population we call the Turkic people. The problem being is that there is an infinitely subtle curve, right, of crime, from murder to harm to theft to fraud to socialization of losses to privatization of commons, all the way up to conspiracy, to sedition, to treason, by all the various means that are possible, which Martin and I have documented in such painful detail that you just, reading it makes you so angry that it's almost impossible to tolerate. The problem is, there's only one way to prosecute a criminal, and that's force. Now, it can be indiscriminate violence, it can be organized violence, or it can be organized force, which we call the courts. Now, I know a lot of us would like to buy large lengths of rope and conduct some guillotines and maybe put up some rooms or some firing squads, and that is emotionally fulfilling in the moment, but it's very hard to maintain legitimacy if that's your technique of correction, because the law has three objectives. It has restitution, it has punishment, meaning you stop it, and it has prevention, which is and the people who would imitate you. So, yes, there's value in eliminating people physically from the gene. What does Hans Hop called it?
Physical removal. Yeah.
Physical removal. But the reality is that if you do a lot of that, every time you do that, you're removing the trust in the polity's will for you to have any say, control, or influence.
I would say it's kind of like a Navy SEALs guy once said, with leadership power. You can do those like impulsive moments, but you really have to bank on that using other methods to gain people's trust.
Mm-hmm. So I mentioned previously, just a few minutes ago, how people take the frame they understand. You've got to think of it as that the world is actually fairly chaotic. You have a limited intellectual capacity, you have a limited time, you have limited means of obtaining knowledge, unless you're gifted with relatively accessible intelligence, relatively accessible resources, and relatively accessible time, and the interest to pursue that versus other interests. Then, it's quite hard to learn enough of a window to make judgments about the future. So it's not like we're in this room being disregarding that. But the reality is that because neural economy is what it is, we can't move people from one place to another if all their incentives and all their cognitive structure is in line without the application of enough incentive to shift them. Right? So So they're in this place, right? Oh, shoot, I'm trying to get this one. So just as people are stuck in a frame, they're stuck in a generational frame, right? They're stuck in what we call the generational cycle, which is when they come of age and their formative years, that's the model of the world they hold. And it tends not to vary much. You get older, you get more conservative generally, but that's it. So the generation, this generation is stuck in 2005, and I'm talking about the current one. So we have a problem not only of factions, not only of sexes, but of generations and of frames. And what the enemy's strategy has been for over 100 years is fomenting conflict between these. In other words, they're using baiting into hazard, seduction, to make a false promise of freedom from the laws of nature, scarcity, human behavior, evolutionary necessity, and truth and logic, which is what postmodernism is. So it's basically truth Marxism, the destruction of truth. So because of these reasons, and because of the rate they're working, nobody tends to see this coming, except those of us who study these things. And every single variable that we know, which I showed you earlier, says we're going to have a civil war. So if you look at the history, Rudyard gives a good talk on this. If you look at the history of revolutions, they all say, yesterday I thought things were stressful but not going anywhere, and today there's a revolution, everything's on fire. So you can't use your judgment as a test of the proximity. You can only do what most of you do, which is look at the stream of information and judge the direction of it given the opportunities that are there. So while there is difficulty in prediction because of all the factors I've just made, that's a wide distribution of variables affecting whatever would cause a trigger or cliff event that would move us from it's not going to happen to, oh shit, it's going to happen. Some of you have been with me a long time. When I was talking about revolution in 2012 to 2014, how many people called me a nutcase? Everybody, right? When I said, I don't have a choice in this. The data says it's going to happen somewhere out here. I don't know when. I just know it's going to happen because it has to. All the data is saying it has to because it's too intolerable for people to live in the current condition. But now, if you ask about the Civil War, the next Civil War, it's like almost half of the population thinks it's going to happen. And it's in the news all the time.
People are starting to see it also with the Hellene disaster, with FEMA intervening and stopping people from helping each other.
Yes. We should. That's just the CDC, the FEMA, the World Health Organization. All these captured organizations don't play war games like the military does. Because they don't, nothing they claim, say, or whatever is empirical. Whereas if you actually put a militia together, I think I've talked to you about this recently. You put a militia together, and I just mean that is a workforce of the population of hospitaliers, construction and removal repair people, and electricians, earth workers, and then financial people. If you put those people together, I know what I did when I was 14 and there was a hurricane. I went out and cleaned a restaurant so they're spoiling food. So, and you know what happens anywhere today is like it's a sport in certain parts of the South to take your boat and go help a flood victim. So if you had that organization, that's been great. But we have FEMA as this bureaucracy. How many people do they have? And how many boots on the ground do they have? They have like 1,500 people. It's a total waste of money, and they have no boots on the ground, so they have no way to execute anything. So there's a determinism of conflict and indeterminism of means and the impossibility of timing. We can't know when this is going to happen, but there's a continuing convergence among those of us who look at these things that it's somewhere between now and 2030. So how much time do we have?
6 years. Did this.
If we're lucky, we have 6 years. We need to think in the 1.5 to 3 year time frame to be able to get our work done, published, and visible, and then relationships built to distribute it. So when this is the case, when there's a difficulty in predicting a civil war, there's an opportunity to counter it by producing a revolution instead. Now, what does a revolution mean? It means a change in the institutional structure and rules by which the polity operates. It doesn't mean we have to start hanging people in large numbers, even if that would be fun. And I'm saying this as someone must have been on Ukrainian television 20 times saying, the problem you had is you didn't hang anybody. You didn't make the government scared of you. You didn't need to hang 1,000 people, but you needed to hang some people. The problem is you want to create an incentive to not do it again. So I'm saying let's be reasonably peaceable about this, but there are some statements that need to be made. So my point here is it's unpredictable if you let yourself be a victim of it. But if you try to control it, you can produce less harm than the harm of civil war. Now, I'm going to cover civil war a little bit today, and I'm going to skip over most of my documentation of civil wars because of the time it would take to do it, and you were very patient of me giving the other things. I'll skip over some, and I'll just use civil wars in the context of what we would see today. But a civil war would be incredibly destructive because it's not going to be like the American Revolutionary War. It's going to be like Syria. It's going to be 5 guys kill those 6 neighbors, and then somebody else kill these 3 neighbors. And it's going to expand like that to where there's roving groups of people like that were in the BLM riots doing some things, and roving groups of other guys trying to stop them and hunt them down. There's going to be there would be attacks on infrastructure, attacks on political figures. It would just get unbearable. And so we don't want a Syria to happen here. First, because the government hasn't got the resources to stop it. They are dependent right now on whack-a-mole. Anything that sticks its head up, get it early. But if a civil war breaks out by not one shooter losing his temper, but a bunch of people starting to take action in large numbers, and instead of talking macho bullshit to talk each other into it, they're just usual real grown-ups that say, well, this just get out of hand. And the next thing they'll do is say, wow, we can do this for a profit. We can steal shit while we're doing this. This will just escalate. So we would end up with a Syria and a French Civil War of incredible destructive power. I was going to spend about an hour talking about this subject. Do you think I need to cover it in any more detail than that, or is that pretty obvious? It will not be a civil war of North versus South or state versus state. It will be a race, class, culture, political war of all against all in a continuing spiral of escalation of what we would think of and our ancestors would think of as feuds. So this is what I'm saying our responsibility is. Our responsibility is to produce a solution and try to get people to do a reformation rather than a civil war. Does that make sense to everyone? Does anyone disagree with that position? Does anybody have any comments about it?
What was the last word you said? Ancestors would think of it as blank.
Feuds.
Gotcha.
Because in most of history, uncles and brothers and fathers defend the family, the extended family, the traditional family. And if there's a slight somewhere, you retaliate. Now, in Germanic history, we're kind of odd in that we focus on restitution. So there was always some means of restitution. But because of the Romans and furthermore in the later time periods, we became very fond of capital punishment. So as most of you know who've read Harpending, the Europeans engaged in extraordinary genetic suppression, or what they call genetic pacification, from about 1200 onward. And this turns out to be about 1% of the population every decade. I used to I have no idea why I used to say every year when I know it's not a year, but it's every decade. That's a lot of genetic suppression.
I think it's actually every generation.
I thought it was every decade. It's probably every generation, that seems right. So between the invention of bipartite manorialism in Holland in the 700-800s, which gave birth to the absolute nuclear family, meaning that you cannot get access to land to farm unless you're married and of good character. So what did that do to reproductive selection processes? If you actually take this genetic pacification down to people who engage in crime, actually get hung, look what happens to genetic pacification. By the time of the late Middle Ages, everything above the Hainaut line, which is sort of from northern France down to the north of Italy, back up to St. Petersburg, everything has been genetically pacified to the point where they've almost everybody in what we would consider the lower classes was the result of downward migration of the middle classes. And then, of course, when we get into the modernity and we get the availability of travel and colonization, you get places like this part of Texas, which is basically a great sponge for absorbing underutilized genetic capital in the form of genetic middle classes, which is really a pretty good thing, available to do farm work. So the U.S. benefited from this Anglo-Germanic combination because you had this industriousness of the Germans, and you had this entrepreneurship and entrepreneurial technological sense of the English. It's turned out to be pretty beneficial. I don't know how many of you know this, but of course the Declaration and the Constitution were written in German as well. They were just not published in German because the Congress didn't want to pay the publishing fee for printing. They weren't printed in large numbers in German because they didn't want to pay the fee. That's discrimination, if you ask me. I did organized crime already. Okay. I had spent on giving a long lecture on the cause of civil wars. And I've created, hopefully, the explanation that, look, we're the subject of not only an elite doing the usual overproduction of elites, doing the usual parasitism upon the population, but we've got a hostile elite that's not trying to just profit, but trying to profit by destroying the civilization. I don't just mean the culture, I mean the gene pool. It's an attempt at genocide. You don't go by what people tell you, what people say they do. You go by what they do and the evidence of their consequences. So if you want to talk about the tendency of bringing about a civil war, we've said there's data, right? We've understood that this is just crime. We understand that it's curable by the creation of market for the suppression of these kind of crimes. But we've already tried a lot of stuff. We've hoped they'd learn. We've tried moral appeal. We've tried debate. We've tried producing competing thought projects. We tried the vote. At this point, we've exhausted attempts at cooperation. We may have a small chance via the court, which we are going to try. But the Constitution doesn't contain enough of the common law to assist in this. In other words, there is stuff they brought over from the common law and put into code and Constitution, and there's stuff they've systematically ignored in the common law in order to make this stuff happen. So there are judges on the Supreme Court who are in the majority who might take this argument, but their fear would be that by doing that argument, they would be the subject of retaliation. So I think they're afraid to take it. We have no monarchy to appeal as a judge of last resort. I don't know why, whenever I talk about monarchy, I said, we screwed up. You don't replace institutions, you add institutions from them as the market expands and you narrow the responsibility. The responsibility of monarchy is a judge of last resort. You need to go to the monarchy and say, this legislature, this court, this whatever failed. That's why our presidents have the traditional ability to issue pardons, because institutions do fail. If you read Burnham, he'll tell you, democracy is a great institution, except it's really highly prone to failure. Because people end up making decisions that are possible to make within the contingents of the members of the group that's deciding, and often at the influence of members of the group that have a superior influence. But that is not a very good answer to happen. It's just the one that can happen. So democratic systems fail all the time. You need a person of last resort who's not a bureaucracy. He doesn't require agreement, who simply says, this is tradition, this is in the interest of our people, this was a reasonable mistake, or this was a reasonable ambition, and this procedural process that we've elected to handle most cases, because they is insufficient to handle the exceptions that they fail to handle. So what do we have left to us? If we have no monarchy, the court probably won't do it. We've exhausted voting, we've exhausted debate, we've exhausted counter-argument, because they don't argue with the truth or rationality or responsibility. They just argue with whatever will get emotionally into will get them access to power. So we only have one choice, and that's a suit against the state for the redress of grievances, which is what the founders did with the appeals to the monarchy, the Declaration of Independence, which was an or else, and the Constitution, which is their correction. How much does the Constitution vary from the laws of England? Well, aside they did some bad imitation of the French, not much. However, what lever do we have? We have only the threat of insurrection or force to move their hand, or the prosecution of the Civil War to replace them and institute our demands. And in the mere act of self-defense against their organized criminality, in other words, if they try to deny us, they're basically admitting their guilt. They're not basically, they're admitting their guilt. There's nothing we're asking for that isn't a restoration of responsibility and reciprocity by the restoration of reciprocity, the prosecution of criminality. Criminals need to be stopped, restitution performed, punishment issued in order to prevent a repetition, not just for us, but for those generations that follow. And hopefully to reverse, because people of us are still alive, there's still enough of our traditions, that if we institute them, we can restore them. So the question is, do you believe you can vote harder, convince harder, reproduce faster, or do you prefer to believe that we must act to stop our victimization by an organized crime system, hiding behind the pretentious costume of virtue, obscuring their sartorial dress, what they're actually wearing, of baiting people in hazards of submission, extraction, devolution, and decay? All right, I have to decide. How much more can I force you to sit through? But sitting through this is the fun part, because we get to talk about things that are fun, which will mean you guys will go off on a tangent, and I will, and of course we'll go to hell. Anyway, I'm going to talk about this. What I would like to do is just go through a list of the categories of revolution, how they're performed. That's it, right? I want to just so you know what the inventory of cards is. The second thing is what would work in the U.S. when considering those things, and what wouldn't. And the last thing is what we recommend, of course. And I'm going to go over the nasty bits. Because we're in Texas, I had planned on going through how I would actually recommend executing the start of a revolution, beginning with Texas. And I'm going to do that just because we're here, and because it will cause you to think differently about what it means to run a revolution today. versus what it meant in the past. Because a war is won by logistics and strategy within the competency of the people to apply tactics. But if you ask anybody high enough in the military, it's like, it's no good. You can't pay the guys, feed the guys, disempower the enemy, and remove their ability to act against you. And no, I am not going to let the FBI trick me here. Okay. Quick storm through the means of revolution and civil war. What's the difference between a revolution and a civil war? This is a great question. Well,
Revolution is a revolt against the current order. A civil war is two sides of the current order fighting each other.
correct. I would say that a revolution is a process of replacing parasitic elites with a new set of elites. In other words, a market crash that brings about a replacement production of the existing system of production with another one. I would say a civil war requires a couple of things, and one of them, the one we don't want, is chaos. The one we'd like is closer to the IRA, which is there's a political wing and an action wing. So there's somebody they will talk to as an intermediary, the political wing, and there's a bunch of people distributed around the world who do things. I'm not recommending the IRA strategy. I'm just bringing out the importance of a political wing and an action wing, because there has to be somebody to talk to. Because the whole point here, of course, is to achieve the government's capitulation in the shortest period of time possible. I'm going to tell you in advance, I don't believe that will take longer than 90 days. So, speed through the means of revolution and civil war, right? The spectrum of categories of political conflict, the examples across the spectrum, how those things vary by stage of development, because you can't think the same thing that works in Syria is going to work in Paris or Moscow or whatever. Everybody's stage of development determines what's necessary. And then there's a variation by ethnic and ideological differences. In other words, the resources you have to work with, both psychologically, socially, culturally, as well as as long as the genetic resources you have to work with. Obviously, the conduct of a civil war among a population of people with 70 IQs is different from 85 IQs, is different from 100 IQs, is different from 115 IQs. Hopefully, we could get the population back to 115 so we don't have any of these problems in the future at all, but God forbid. If there's nobody to sell rent-seeking to, sell false promises to, there's a much more difficulty in having no reliance between the people who want to be irresponsible and the people who want to prey on those of us who are. Okay. Categories. Spontaneous uprising. They arrive from grassroots ideas. They begin without any formal organization. Tiananmen, the Egyptian Revolution, the Gezi Park protests, the Sudanese Revolution. This is a tailor-made way for the U.S. government to crush.
You're saying that the government has a pretty good strategy with crushing the...
They work by which is what everybody on the right thinks there's a Fed under the rug somewhere. They work by, who's the guy I really like? That's the very religious guy that thinks I'm a Fed. Eric something or other. I've been to his house. I love him. He's got a great guy.
Harvall?
What?
Eric Olden.
Yeah. I mean, this is a good human being, right? I've been to his house. I've met his family. He's a God-fearing, Christian, moral man, willing to get out there and do the work to make the world a better place, okay? He thinks I'm a Fed. All right, so if he only knew. Popular protests and movements. These are usually reasonably successful as protests to get the government to change policy. like the Arab Spring, Iranian Green Movement, the anti-austerity protests in Greece and Spain, the Colombian National Strike, the Yellow Vest Movement, right? Are they successful in turning over elites? Did the Yellow Vest Movement achieve anything? No. Insurrections. These are violent uprisings that occur immediately, chaotically, and sometimes spontaneously, usually in reaction to a policy that causes a trigger event. The Hungarian Revolution, the Paris Commune, the Estonian Singing Revolution, which is very cute, by the way, the Baltic Way, or the Baltic states. These are short-lived, intense, and they lack a full strategy or an operational plan. But what do they ever really achieve? Well, they achieve change if they're intense enough and long enough. What happened with Occupy Wall Street? How long did it last? How does our government defeat the Soviets? How does our government defeating the Russians? How is our government trying to defeat China?
By having assets in their government.
Sorry?
By having assets in their government.
Okay, I'm trying to have a serious conversation here. What they do is they count on their capacity to endure your minimum ability to produce chaos until you're exhausted. They outlast you. So what the Chinese do, their means of warfare, is delay and deceive. They tell you, we're a good people, we have good nature, know that we're not performing aggression, this is just rational, right? And then what they do is they accumulate force until you have no ability to resist them, and they win, all right? The American strategy is to take advantage of the fact that the continent is a vast island that's resource autarkic. In other words, you don't need anybody else's trade. And that they can use that economy and their distance to basically outspend and wear down the competition. Reagan understood this, and he told Gorbachev he was going to do it. And he did it. So when you're talking about an insurrection, how long have you got to make it go on? But the second thing is, how easy is it to demonize you? Why? Now, you guys, some of you know, I didn't go to January 6th, right? I was going to until I found out who was in charge, and I'm like, okay, this is going to be a clusterfuck. But if I had, I had a speech. If I had gone into the Congress, laid down that speech, demanding freedom of speech so that we could resolve our differences peacefully, how would they have framed that? In other words, it's not. It makes a difference what you're asking for. If you don't make the story, I'm hoping you'll support me here. If you don't create the narrative, they will create it for you. All right, the next one is guerrilla warfare. What's the difference between an insurrection and guerrilla warfare? Time. So that's the Cuban Revolution, but the one that's important, I think, is Mao's Long March, the Vietnamese, the Nicaraguan, and Salvadoran civil wars. How successful is guerrilla warfare versus an insurrection or uprising? Much more successful. Why? Time. But how much organization do you need for guerrilla warfare versus how much for an insurrection versus how much for this versus this? All of a sudden, these things, we went from these things are cute to these things can work to all of a sudden these things do work. So what's happening is the organizational cost is increasing as the capacity to obtain victory increases. Are you getting my point here? Is this coming across good? The next is political strikes and nonviolent resistance. This is an organized effort to overthrow a regime through strikes, boycotts, civil obedience, nonviolent protests. These methods can be highly organized and are aimed at paralyzing the state. Examples are Gandhi, the South African, the People Power Revolution, then the Velvet Revolution in the Czech Republic, and the Polish Solidarity Movement. What's the difference between these countries here and these countries here?
Elite support who already wanted the change to happen.
Correct. Hope you figure out where I'm going with this.
Organization.
Exactly. So the next one is a coup d'etat. Where do coup d'etats happen? What does a coup d'etat say about your institutional development? It's weak. Well, who do you have to organize to make that happen? You have to organize elites who want to rotate because they fear that if these group of elites are eliminated, they're also going to be punished. So they would rather eliminate them and get a new ones in there than see themselves be punished, or frankly, their themselves and their families. And what about a civil war? This is between organized factions with military arms, with general strategy supply lines. How much organization does that take? But how likely is that to win versus spontaneous violence? So the Russian Revolution, the Russian Civil War, the American Civil War, and the Spanish, the Syrian, the Chinese, the Yemeni. Do they work? They work. Why? More people, more time, more chaos, more organization. So the American government defeats its enemies by time. How do you defeat that enemy? I don't know. I want you to think about that. So, ideological and organized revolutionary movements. The Bolshevik, Chinese, Mexican, Iranian, Nicaraguan. How many people are as old as me that remember the bombings in the 60s and 70s? So, this has been erased from the record of education on purpose. But there were bombs going off all over this country every week or two, all the time, during the Marxist attempt here in this country. Why don't you ever hear about it? You'll hear about the civil rights movements, but do you hear about the bombings that were happening all the time? You heard about January 6th, but did you hear about the bombing of the Capitol during that time? No.
Weather Underground, right?
Exactly. How much organization do you need to pull this off? You need to do what we're doing, which is start small and build until you have a community of people who has common interests, a common understanding of the problem, and a common understanding of victory conditions. And how long does it take? It certainly takes years. I always say, we sit around teasing each other, right? But Lenin and those guys, they were sitting in coffee shops doing exactly what we do here. That's how it works. So they become organic, evolve into organized. French, Romanian, Mongolian, Algerian. This requires you have a voice. I don't believe we can get that voice. Then there are external revolutions and proxy wars. In other words, it would be very easy if you wanted to conduct a revolution or civil war here to obtain resources from foreign powers who would be happy to see a turnover. They might not be so happy to see the turnover once they see what we have planned, but they would be happy to support a turnover. What? Question?
Would that be would we be able to combine that strategy and the eighth one?
You're jumping ahead.
Okay.
You've been listening to Brandon too much. So, organic revolutions start as unplanned, increasing organization. As they evolve, they become organized and structured. And as they're fully organized, at the most end of the spectrum, you get coup d'etats and civil wars and ideologically driven movements. Remember what I said? That I don't look at the world as what's the thing that works best. I look at the field of possibilities, and I look at the information stream and seize the opportunity. So you might say, I want to get this done because it's easy. Not you personally. One might say that this will be the fastest route that I understand to make this happen if everybody agreed with me. No, you just fucked up there. All right. I don't look at that. I said a very interesting thing where you just jumped ahead is that, do you do one of those things? You do all those things. You seize the opportunity to move the needle however you can move it. Does the left necessarily plan, or do they just incrementally seize opportunity after opportunity after opportunity to undermine? What's the problem with conservatives? I want to be sure I'm going to show up and we're going to win and I'm not going to get wounded.
You're going to guarantee me I'm going to win, otherwise I'm not showing up.
Yep.
Never happens.
All conflict is a gambler.
And mostly that they start conserving what left brought about.
Conflict is only a gamble if you don't understand what the other side's criteria are for running. When we were in Maidan, I can't emphasize this enough. Cops look really strong when they're in large numbers until you have girls filling 5-gallon drums of gasoline from siphoning from gas tanks, guys finding beer bottles, and even, I mean, you gotta understand, for a Slav to pour beer on the ground in order to make a Molotov is a serious commitment. And so I'm standing there behind this basically tent, what do you call it, canvas stuff, tarp. And the guys are on the other side are cooking, and we've got this chain going, and it's going down this line, production line. Are these like 50-year-old guys doing this? No, some high school kids doing most of them. You know that asshole you went to high school with is always starting trouble, always being troublemaker, whatever? Those are the fuckers who throw Molotov cocktails. And they love it. So those cops, they look really tough until all the shit's on fire. So when we were over the way we I don't want to make it sound like I had more participation than I did. They went over and they kept capturing government buildings, right? But what happens when you can't go to work and the phones don't work? How does the government organize? And so we're just taking over government buildings one at a time. I remember in this one court, I can't remember which building it is, but there's Maidan Square with the big pole there with the winged victory thing on top. All right. And then there's this building over here in the corner. And we're going in there. And the guys, hold on to this for a minute. And they're taking sheets of metal and bending them into shields and riveting leather to the back of the shields. So the guys can, they're cranking them out like a medieval guild. Right? So you understand that what you see as fearful, I saw as a party. My experience is this is a party, right? It's a party because when you're surrounded by tires filled with dirt, so nobody can get to you, when you're carrying nothing other than Molotov cocktails, they're afraid to get to you, you're pretty invulnerable. The only problem is how do the chicks get the food in to feed you? We had girls running out to freaking 3 cities over to get Band-Aids and stuff, right? I'm like, no, we're not Band-Aids. I'm not seeing anybody get injured. The biggest problem is hurting your hand when bringing a brick out of the street so you can throw it at somebody. So my point is, my point here really is, if you're afraid, you haven't organized. If you're vulnerable, you haven't planned. And if you think like movies or history, you don't understand.
What about forcing the government to act? Since their advantage is time, when they, if you force them to act early, they lose their advantage. Is that
Forcing the government to what?
act?
Act, yes. You want to bait the government into hazard. In other words, what we said in Ukraine is we want them to shoot us. The minute they do, they're done. Which they did. It cost 100 lives, but they got a revolution out of it.
People don't realize the Portuguese Revolution, there was less than 10 people that made it happen, and everyone else was just following along.
Yep. Okay. So I got my point across. Do you see any similarity in those lists to what you think would work today? I already gave you the answer. What's the stage of our institutional development?
Very high.
It's very high. So, if you can't outlast their ability to hold on to power and at least keep you at bay, what can you do for victory? What are your victory conditions? In other words, in military war, I'm going to kill your command, control, and logistics network because your people in the field, they're just sponges for artillery. But what happens if I take out your command and control, your communications, take out your logistics, so that those guys are basically sitting there in the field, as the Russians are right now, starving? What's the parallel in military conflict in political conflict? What's the parallel? You're not going to decapitate our leaders. I mean, I can think of a few. Can I keep their heads? All right, so I don't need to cover this, but the point I was, I'm leaving that question open. What's the political, civil war, or revolutionary equivalent to decapitation, command and control, and logistics, right? Now, I already covered variation by stage of development, right? Right? I already covered moderate, right? Polish and people, fragile or collapsed institutions, and high institutional development, right? Weak but functional institutions, proxy wars, high institutional development, which is the coups, general patterns and conclusions. Weak institutions, countries with weak institutions or collapses are really easy to get away with, because what's the rigidity versus the investment in organization? What's the rigidity between the investment and organization? What's the rigidity versus the investment in organization? So what message am I getting across with organization? What threat do I think the right faces?
The inability to sustain.
Sorry?
The inability to sustain until victory.
The inability to first compromise for the benefit of each other. The inability to submit to a collective leadership who doesn't exactly overlap with you. The inability to sustain operations in the field. And the inability to have these show up. Excuse me. Did I say that? Did I say that out? Is that on record? All right. The second dimension I want you to think about is ethnic and ideological differences. So the Arab Spring and the Sudanese Revolution were ethically homogenous, right? The Iranian Green Movement and the Black Lives Matter were driven by racial inequality. Actually, they're driven by racial proximity. It's because proximity exposes differences in ability. What about insurrections, the Hungarian Revolution, the Paris Commune, right? Insurrections in ethnically divided societies focus on ethnic dominance and exclusion. Does that sound familiar to you? So what does that say? Interesting. But if that's your message, how easy is that to demonize you and legitimize the state enemy and legitimize the factions that are in the state, these hostile elites? Can they delegitimize you if you take this strategy? What about guerrilla warfare? Ethnic differences derive guerrilla warfare when marginalized groups seek autonomy. Are conservatives a marginalized group? I mean, are white males a marginalized group, which is kind of humorous to me? Are males a marginalized group? So the problem is that when you base it on that, now you don't have the elites as your enemy, you have the other factions as your enemy. So when I'm saying this stuff, what do you think I'm trying to eliminate? Right? I'm trying to give you the options and try to tell you what works. I'm trying to tell you the requirements, but you see what I'm trying to eliminate? These favor nonviolent resistance to achieve it. Can that work here?
I don't think we have the
Again,
support for it to work here.
Again, they have elite support. We don't.
Correct. We don't have elite support. Yeah, I think I've made my point here. I don't want to go through all this stuff. So when ethnic difference is the primary driver, it takes insurrections, guerrilla war, ethnic coups, or civil war. When they're ideological driven, they take organization, nonviolent resistance, guerrilla warfare, and civil war. And when they're mixed dynamics, they can be, we see mixed dynamics, it's much harder to make people organize. So my point is, which of these would you call us, would say we're sort of working on? This is important.
I would say 3.
I'm just getting you to think about it.
Or you may be my
Sorry?
It's a little bit of like,
I would say it's mostly 3,
Yeah.
but are we proposing an ethnic solution? Are we proposing an ideological solution? Can we achieve that ideological solution without support of elites? Or can we only achieve it with threat of insurrection, guerrilla warfare, or civil war? What are you saying? Go ahead.
I'd say push ideological and to get elite support and threaten with ethnic if we do not get elite support.
Correct. So remember when I said don't get into one trap? Right? What we're trying to do is everything. So look at the resource we need and compare them to what our opportunities and costs are. So I have tried today to get across a couple of ideas. One is our mission and strategy. The other is it's just fucking crime. This crime can be suppressed with a system of measurement. And that there's a field of opportunities, a field of tools you can use to bring about change. And we don't really fit into these categories that well. We have to look at a hybrid solution. So I also said, don't get stuck in a rut. Don't do what you think has worked in history. Don't do what you've seen in the movies or read in a book. Look at what problems exist and what solutions exist and what challenges exist. And as far as I can tell, the challenge comes down to organizing the right, especially when there's a lot of noisy pussies. Okay, a successful revolution creates a new system of government, achieves long-standing stability. A failed revolution leads to prolonged chaos, a return to authoritarian rule, and results from an inability to new institutions. But are we trying to build new institutions? Why has the English civilization lasted longer than any other political system? Why is the American system the oldest political system in the world? What's different about the Anglo model that other countries and civilizations don't have?
the rule of law.
Rule of law. All we have to do is change the rule of law because that's the system by which we're engineered. So are we really trying? Are we trying to address inequalities? We don't think of it that way, but when we say we're trying to suppress the criminality of elites extracting from our people, isn't that inequality? The problem is they frame it as we need to take more of your shit and give it to others and we get a piece. We frame it as we're just going to stop your criminality and then there'll be more for our people. So are we asking to create, is there any in other words, our system's been stable for a couple 100 years. The English system's been relatively stable for 1,000. So when you look at this system and you say, okay, well, they got this rule of law thing, and these, and Is that, so are we looking to create some weird new instability? No, we're not trying to create an unstable system. Are we trying to say, we need to try this brand new thing that's ideal and we thought it up and it'll be magic and we'll make good decisions? Are we suggesting that? In fact, we're not suggesting any positivas. We're simply saying increase the precision of measurement and the suppression of criminality so that these increasingly softer or more abstract crimes can be prosecuted.
We're not coming to destroy the law, but to fulfill it.
I'd marry you for that statement.
So now I regret I said it.
It has happened before.
What's that?
That happened before.
It's happened before.
Someone has done a similar kind of
Say again?
similar right thing to attempted similar
Correct.
kind of thing.
We're essentially, and I'm going to cover that in a bit. The problem with the civil rights is they're empowering the elites. All right, and we are seeking to suppress them. I'm trying to figure out how I'm going to handle the next bit here. All right, we breezed through in an hour. Breezed through the technology of revolution and its constraints. Does that make sense of how we just discussed? Now we're going to talk about the possible means in the context of the U.S. And I'm going to try to do it as fast because what I really want to get to is the naughty stuff, right? And so I'm going to skate through this, take a break, and we'll do that. Does that make sense? Right? So I'm going to try to do this quickly. Popular protests. The most likely form would be an organized nonviolent organized nonviolent resistance. Do you think that would work? Do you think we could even organize? Does the right organize like the left does with labor unions and things like that? No.
I think if we walked out on a group with toothpicks, it would be called insurrection.
Yes, I think so too. The United States has regional divisions, ideological extremes, and ethnic and racial tensions. So right-wing militias and left-wing insurrections could both be worked. Most likely form in this case would be localized sporadic insurrections or guerrilla warfare. What would have to occur, because we've seen insurrections probably won't work, what would happen in guerrilla warfare? It would have to be sustained, right? You think our government would give on guerrilla warfare unless it went scale? They capitulate? We have the same problem of sex and gender divides and ideological polarization. We could have this conflict between the states that would. So again, they'd be nonviolent and organized. But do you think we could pull that off? I don't know. When I look at the secessionist movements, it looks very difficult to me. For civil war to happen is ethnic and ideological factioning or regional secessionism. Of course, I see this as the most certain outcome that will happen if we aren't successful. So it'll be fragmented in regional rather than nationwide conflict. I don't think a coup d'etat is worth talking about. I don't think revolution. I don't think externals are worth it. I don't know if I want to go through all these details. What they're going to basically say in the rest of this is they're going to end up with territories against cities. And I've done a lot of work on that model, and the cities die. And I've done work on at least 4 major cities on how to kill them. And especially if you want to do something like Chicago in the winter, it's gone. You're not talking about killing 100,000 people there. You're talking about killing 5 or 6 million. Just because it's winter and they can't heat their homes or anything else. And you know how many guys it takes to do that? Hardly any.
From a truck driver's perspective, you have like the best case scenario of that city surviving maybe 2 weeks. Like they need daily and weekly, like resupply for food.
The way that we say it is there's 3 minutes without air, 3 days without food, 3 weeks without water. How long? And you basically, I think it's the third meal people get violent. The third meal they miss gets violent. You can imagine all those people barely kept down in urban centers having the mutual belief and justification that they can easily overwhelm local forces. There's only a couple cities in the United States able to field enough people to hold down any kind of unrest. It's about 4 of them. The rest of them can't field enough to do anything without pulling from other cities. All right, so I ran through that quickly. What I want to do is talk about the good stuff. And so I'd like to take a break and come back and talk about the good stuff.